I'm not sure what you thought, my friend, but I thought it was the worst lecture that I personally have ever given, because I ended up trying to explain, I got so frustrated trying to explain Heidegger that I ended up explaining the relationship between small b being and big B being Dasein as an omelet. And that's when I realized I had lost my mind, and that we can't upload that because it is so insane. It's something that could go viral.
I wouldn't see them.
I know, it's just.
I remember you and Hannah Honeywell arguing about onions for about half an hour. You've got to remember that day.
There's a cookbook in there somewhere.
Wasn't it just insane? It was hilarious. I thought I was going to lose my mind at one point. I tried one way. That's right. And then I came up with, well, why don't you just think about the idea of things resting, like for the dwelling. So then we went into the whole thing about how you rest meat after you cook it. So we had an entire menu that was being planned. I thought to myself, oh my goodness, no, that will not be uploaded. That particular one. It really is just not happening. That was so bad. And in fact, someone came up to me afterwards and said, that was the best class. I was like, I really understand it now. Okay, so I'm just gotta admit when you don't do it right, and believe me, this really wasn't right.
So you're gonna assess some omelets.
I know! I just can see these papers are gonna come in, you gotta, to get Dasein happening, you have to break a few eggs. I was thinking, oh my God. And then the omelet experience came forward. It was just awful. Okay. You ready? So you presenting today?
Yeah. I was just assuming numerical order. Just relaxing. I'm chapter 8. So
I see.
6,
I'm
yeah,
just.
Okay, I see. Yes, are you ready?
No.
Yes, we're going to throw. Okay, so just before we begin, I wanted to say that I've written to Isabel Stengers. I'm just waiting to hear from her, but she has basically confirmed on one level that she wants to be a CFAR member, which is great, and on another level that she'll hopefully have an article for the thesis, which would be perfect. The other thing is that I'm hoping that what we pull out of this today is this wider sense of what it is about Foucault's work that is on the same playing field, if not more so than, let's say, some of these other works that we're looking at. I feel that I have not been giving Foucault his due because I was so much a Foucauldian. I thought I'd be sort of ruining the waters or something, like being too aggressive with my own views on these things. But going back and reading Foucault, and particularly there's another one that we don't have yet, we haven't put on the agenda to read, but it's something you might want to consider called Will to Truth. It's his first series of lectures, because God knows you have nothing else to do. But you could take a look at it. The idea is trying to think through an aesthetic methodology that has a political color to it, so that the political isn't an add-on. Just like we've been fighting to make sure that the senses are not an add-on. It's this question of the political, and there's a big fight about that, because when you think about the word political, what's really being said there? And I think that one of the discussions I had actually today with Lauren, was this notion of suspending. What we were suspending? We were suspending something. It wasn't the ethical.
It was to do with that assassination of time, or the assassination of experience.
Oh, that's it. Yes. So the Leotard's work on the assassination of experience through painting, by painting. One of the things that's interesting about that Lauren pointed out today in her tutorial was the way in which experience isn't really assassinated, but it's suspended. And this notion of the suspended, now we've got that through Kierkegaard and the suspension of the teleological suspension of the ethical. But this notion of this suspended something, I want you to maybe think about it with respect to Foucault and the notion of the suspended political. Now he's raised that in terms of subjective, what do you call it, subjective knowledges. He's mentioned this thing, but I think that we could push that further. So I just wanted to give that as a sort of a backdrop. And then, Barbara, if you could start off. Okay, it's your turn, Stuart.
So in the 6th chapter, he started with the story of how France was founded.
Yes.
But he, and the first thing that I noted down for myself, he questioned that was it found or founded, which is I think an interesting point. And then he goes on discussing how the French are diseased from the Franks and
French are what? Diseased?
descended. Sorry.
Oh, descended, yeah, I was gonna say.
And then he discusses how sovereignty of the King of France is the same type of the sovereignty of the Roman emperor, and he tries to find a way how these basically patterns are found also in sovereignty of the king. But what was interesting for me is that he ends up with I also noted it down. Up to this point, history had never been anything more than the history of power as told by the power itself, which is something that I think connects us to.
This sounds very
history.
Marxist, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So what makes him different than Marx? I mean, Marx's famous sentence is, of course, power, you know, that all knowledge is the knowledge of the ruling classes. Right, so why is Foucault different?
Because I think, or as I understood it, in his beliefs, this breakdown happened in the 18th century, and with the development of nationalism.
What breakdown? The breakdown of the ruling classes being able to export their notion of power?
Yeah, because he says that there is a new subject to history, and this new subject is society, or as it was called back then, nation. And then he tries to find his way what nation means, and society means.
So,
I'm confused.
yes.
Okay.
Yes, but that's okay. Throw the rest of it out and then we'll have a little field day.
And there is this paragraph that I like is at this time the nation is by no
Sorry,
means
what page is that?
134,
Okay.
and it's middle of the page.
Mm-hmm.
At this time, the nation is by no means something that is defined by its territorial unity, a definite political morphology, or its systematic subordination to some imperium. The nation has no frontiers, no defined system of power, and no state. The nation circulates behind frontiers and institutions. The nation, or rather nations, or in other words, the collections, societies, groupings of individuals who share status, morals, customs, and certain particular law in the sense of regulation, statutes rather than statistic law. History will be about these elements.
So what is it about that you like?
It just kept me thinking about, of course, my research and how history was taught in my particular case, in my elementary school studies and my studies, because he also mentioned that how problematic was back then how history was taught as basically a power. I lost my train of thought.
Let's start again. Let's start at the very beginning. You said the first thing he argues is that, is society founded or found? What do you think he's getting at there? And what does that have to do on the wider sense of, let's say, epistemology, aesthetics?
It's whether society was invented
Yeah.
or it was discovered by someone or something.
And when he talks about invention then, how does that work? Like if I wanted to invent a city, what would I have to do?
It's just creating this history.
Yeah, there's
Through
some,
telling a story.
could I just go somewhere and go, I'm going to now create a culture? How does that happen? How does the invention, obviously one person is not gonna go in and do that, so how does the invention, who invents? Who is it that invents? What invents? What invents what? The boat comes over, the colonialists jump out, they look around, they go, wow, this land looks interesting, think I'll have it. They take it, they found a time period, they found a thing, and then they go off, right? This is not enough to make it have stuck. How did it happen?
This is, Foucault sort of talks about the administrators, doesn't he? So those that write the histories. And we've already got a culture that's kind of driving that. A sovereign in
Okay, I'm gonna, because you guys are, yes,
I thought it was great reading this chapter 6, the story. So the story is kind of, you have the story of France, as it said, you've got the Gauls and the Romans who invade the Gauls, they take over Gaul, they take away the Gaulish nobility, disarm them, kill them off, as it were, but then they find themselves without a warrior elite, so they have to import mercenaries to protect their now possession. The Gauls are still separate from the Romans, as it were, but then they're disarmed, as it were, but they have to pay the taxes to pay for all these mercenaries. The story becomes the Franks are the brothers of the Gauls. So when then the Franks invade, and usurp the Romans, then the Franks, the stories that they tell is that they're part already of the Gaulish nation. They're one big family, tribe, or kind of thing. But the Gauls, the Franks have a different social setup. As I was saying, the Romans have an imperial structure, kind of sovereign at the top. But the Gauls, the Franks have they're more of a warrior caste, and their king, as it were, is only for these kind of invasion, these raids, this kind of thing. So these leaders are not imperial in that sense. And the story goes on because what happens is when the Franks then take over the country, they still remain this ferocious warrior caste. So the administration passes into what was left of the Gaulish nobility, who now take on the role of, they eventually move into the church. They inhabit the language of Latin, which the Franks do not speak, and while the Franks then become like crusaders and go off and look at the world beyond this world. And meanwhile, back at home, the Gaulish nobility that had been usurped in the Roman times will come back in as administrators, and this is then the different kind of story that Barbara was saying, it becomes a story of those kind of laws as against the imperial structure. That imperial structure then sticks itself to that bureaucratic state, and there's a relationship between the imperial absolute monarch and this bureaucracy, which is this the church mainly, which is the once usurped Gaulish nobility who come back via that route. So you know, this is this fantastic story that Foucault tells. First of all, lays down this map, this landscape of what the story is in circulation. So the first story, the founding of France, is this one that the Franks maybe and the Gauls are of a brother race. I mean, it's a story of invasions. The Romans invade, then the Franks invade, but the Frankish invasion is not a usurpation because they believe that they're part of the whole Gaulish setup. And so I think what's important in that is the nature of this warrior caste, this Frankish ferocious.
You mean Frank as in French?
The Franks as being this warrior caste and remain this warrior, but they have this freedom. It's mainly the freedom to fight and loot and stuff. And they don't have an absolute king, but when they take over the France, when they invade France and stuff, their temporary leaders, as it will, sort of take on the mantle of an absolute ruler.
So I would like to ask you a question,
Yeah.
which requires, I've got the chart back, I've got our report. I would like you to draw what you're saying, because I think what you need to understand most of all in this group is how the materiality of the social, yeah, there's a pen right there, how the materiality of the social gets established. And it's the materiality he's talking about, because that's what forms. Can you make it a little darker?
Pardon?
Can you make it darker?
Darker, with a red one.
Well, it's just that it's very light the way it's doing
Like that.
it. Yeah, that's good.
Can I say that's France?
That's France, okay.
So so we have the Romans coming here. There's Gaul, let's say. Let's say that's the Frankish kingdom over there. This is very general. I'm not a historian.
No,
okay?
no,
So
this, I just want
yeah.
people to understand.
So the Romans invade
What's
Gaul
getting
and
set
take it
up.
over as a minute. They take it over. They run it. They administer it. To do that, they take out the Gaulish nobility, who are the armed people
Okay, so
within Gaul.
throw them out somehow.
So right there they are. There's the crosses. Most of them are dead.
Okay, right.
Take them out like that. But then the Romans themselves do not have a standing army as such. They then have to apply. They have to
Import
yeah,
mercenaries.
But to pay the mercenaries, they have to tax the local population.
So whoever's left.
The Gauls that weren't of the nobility. It totally makes this place poverty-stricken because of the economics of it. I'm not thinking. So what happens is that when the Franks then decide, because they're a warrior caste, they decide, well, we're going to have one of our adventures. So they invade Gaul. And the story is that they are the brothers of the Gauls already. So it's a kind of odd kind of invasion. They just kind of walk in.
So it's kind of an incestuous invasion.
Yeah, they go into their old hunting lands or ancestral invasion. So they invade. The Franks invade. The Romans they lose. So they then disappear. So now you have this Gaul, the Frankish ferocious, they're described as ferocious, Frankish military caste, as it were, who use the local Gaulish population, as the people to administer it. But within the Frankish noble caste, the warrior caste, they're temporary leaders, which they have most of the time. They don't have these leaders. Take on some of these Roman imperial absolute power, and this is then how the once usurped Gaulish and aristocracy find their way back into power slowly over time by becoming the administrators for this lot who just carry on fighting amongst themselves and whoever they can go off the Franks.
I'm just going to stop you right there, because can you draw like a dotted circle in the middle, and that will stand for the sovereign who was killed, or the sovereign class that was killed.
Yeah.
And
But
so
it
if you
returned.
picture looking at the society down, and you're looking at the sort of the sovereign group, they get sliced out. So that's the first thing.
But then they return as an idea.
They return
the
now
Frankish.
to the Franks.
So the Franks, one of them thinks, we like this power. We're going to stick around and be in power for longer than we usually are.
But the
So
way
for
they
that,
build the power
is through the
so if you can draw the kind of
through
lines.
these crosses. And so what was left of the people from the crosses, then they come back mainly through the church.
So that
as a
creates like a
church
little
through
bit of
Rome-
a,
through
let's
Rome.
say a weave,
Yeah.
like a mat. So
Yeah.
if you make a little mat all around the country, like they bring everybody in.
Yeah, so they return through, and they also administer through Latin, which the Franks do not understand.
So this is important. So
Yeah.
the whole is still there,
Yeah,
right? So
Yeah.
you have
So
a
it-
strength
yeah.
that goes
so
to
Rome
hold
is
the
still
whole.
there. So Rome was usurped, but it's still there in idea, as it were.
Right.
So that so they administer through Latin. The Franks and the rest of this ferocious tribe go off with crusades. They're interested in the other world, as it were. So they go off and fight crusades and stuff. Meanwhile, at home, this lot are busy making laws, which is what they don't understand. The ferocious Franks don't understand because they don't read the Latin and stuff. They don't really properly understand. So they get usurped in that way, and absolute power returns in that manner. This is the story, the basic story, and then it's all about how this administration then becomes, as Barbara said, the story of society, a different story. Whereas this original story was the story of imperial power and the movement of imperial power. It becomes a story of society and the nation,
Mhm.
which it doesn't necessarily mean the borders, but of the people within this area and stuff. I thought it was very fascinating.
No, it's very. Let me, what I'd like you to do, if
Yeah.
you could, is just to draw from the outside to the inside.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, all the way around. No, I mean, just keep drawing them, so all the lines. I'll make this up clear. Sorry. Machine is dying. So, it's very good. So basically you have, first you have this sovereignty situation set up with a head. That's the sovereign head. Then they get killed off. And so what happens is this other thing gets set up, first by infiltrating the social, and there's like a weave that goes on to make it set up so that, but they still can't quite rule, which is part of the problem. So you have this kind of bit of a weave bit happening. So the nation, as it were, is strong but weird, because it's got different groups involved. And now, because there is the Latin being spoken, this is still not being, the power is still up for grabs, and the power eventually consolidates and feeds back into this group, and that's the founding of the social. So when we, Michelle and I, say invention, that it's invented, the invention isn't so much that someone sat there going, wonder if I move this over here, this will happen, or that over there. It's not like an inventor. It's a collective invention. And that's the key here. And the collective invention happens because sometimes it just can, or sometimes there's really stupid reasons, like some people couldn't speak Latin, or they hadn't quite figured out the mercenary issue, or people started running off fighting the crusades somewhere else. So this group isn't like laying down just knitting or something. They're doing something, not that knitting is doing nothing, but you know, there's some other ways in which these little particles are joining together. And then he asked the question, well, if that's the case, then who's ruling this? How does the rule actually happen? And that's the key, because you could make the same map with the invention of any kind of social movement. We could do this with expressionism. We could do this, it's not like somebody sat there going, yes, I think or like if Rothko decided, oh, I think we should have some form of abstract painting. Yes, that's what we'll do. Goes and there's chopping off of what is taken as the norm. You behead the norm. This is the Bataille move. He talks about it in terms of acephalatic, you know, the chopping of the head. This was the foundation of certain forms of fascism, by the way, that you don't need a head, you only need the body. The body is of course the head still exists. So the question is, how does the law become sovereign? Well, in example one, the sovereign is the sovereign, is the king, is the imperial, so on and so forth. That's how the law works. And if you're not with the sovereign, then you're nothing. But then this other thing happens where the social starts being made. All social movements follow this path.
I can
Yeah,
give an
yeah,
example of it.
yeah.
It's not exactly. It was in business. A friend of mine told me about this in business. He worked for a strange example, but he worked for a company, a business of making showers. They made showers. They
Yeah.
made showers. It was a family-run business, always had been. So you had a head, which is the head of the business, and the workers were like the family. They were the
Right.
family. When you move into the modern age and work becomes a bit more difficult and it becomes more global. So the head of the family brings people in to help him run the company. They just happen to be Americans, but they were meant to help him run the company.
Mm-hmm.
They work without him knowing against the head. He loses out. They start talking to other people outside the company. They undercut him. They undermine him. He doesn't really understand. They were brought in to work through work practices that he didn't understand. He gets head chopped off, and then these other people then sell the business to nobody knows who, but it's now got another head. And then that other head then works down out through the workers a whole new set of practices.
Mhm.
Kind of thing. No longer it's family and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's a colder, harder business. Certain things go out the windows, health and safety, because they know they're not going to get inspected that much, that kind of thing. Yeah, those kind of issues, pensions and those things, they all start going. Whereas before you had like a family structure, becomes a different kind of structure. The original is gone, and the other head comes in, and those practices that then go back out to the workers, as it were. And that happens in quite a lot of businesses, the post office.
It happens in all businesses, including this business here.
And I think
in
it's
this
that kind of
university.
model.
No, seriously, it happens in every. What's important here is to understand the way in which the modern or the contemporary operates. This is what he's talking about. So he's talking about how you can have a cohesion that's an invented cohesion without a head, without someone. Now, guerrilla warfare, this is the one part that did go right last night. At least people understood war. Which is more than what happened to the PhD, but whatever. In a guerrilla fighting, there doesn't necessarily have to be a head. What's happening with the under the umbrella called Al Qaeda or even ISIS, one can kill off the head, but it's not necessarily attacking the problem, because the problem is the way in which these rhizomes have spread and gone into a different part to create a social. And so in the case of, this is a very, obviously have to be analyzed much more carefully, but in the case of today, in the Middle East, for example, apart from the fact you have a number of nations fighting with each other, so that's already a problem, so there's a whole divide and conquer thing going on, and that's draining energies, this kind of thing. What else is also happening is the way in which it rhizomatically, multiplies itself. So in other words, it's not just that the Gauls and the Franks come in and they just, hang out together and whatever. There's a multiplication happening. There's a geometric moment that's going on. Not geometric, we call it exponential. There's an exponential thing that starts developing the material of the society, and this is the key. If you gotta try and hear what's being said here. It's very complex, and he uses it in terms of nation building, but we could use it in terms of any building. Anything that is building a ground that is not a real ground, but in other words, it is a real ground in the sense that it will create an ability to set up the meaning. This is what he's getting at here. And all of your PhDs, and probably postdocs as well, but a lot of the PhDs that are going on here, everyone in this group, is working on something that has a very peculiar relationship to materiality. And Foucault is showing how that actually gets set up, because unless you come up with the idea that there's a first cause, so there's the head, and then you go off and you do your thing, and it's either teleologically inspired or whatever. then it's moving a different direction. It creates a different kind of patchwork. In fact, Leotard calls it patchworks. But you don't have to. I mean, Foucault's going to develop this notion of how this materiality gets started. So the first thing to understand is this relationship of found versus founded. Found, nothing is being discovered. It's the founding of something. By founding, it means that that in some way the start gets started. That's when it's founded. But it's not like a group of people came over and decided to put a pole on the ground and start it.
But that's always after the event.
That's always after the event, right? The let's say official founding is always after it's already been founded. Yeah? And that's true for sound, it's true for dwelling, it's true for aesthetics, it's the whole basis of the notion of atmosphere, how this thing gets established, and that's why I'm trying to get you to understand how this founding happens. Because then the next question is, how long is the founding? How much time, what's the duration of the founding? Like did it happen like this? Did it happen over a period of time? Like, what makes the founding stick? That's the third version. So the first is the invention part of the founding, the next is the durational part of the founding, the next is what makes it all cohere together. And that's why your work, for example, isn't weaving, even though you're technically weaving, or whatever you're doing these things. You're actually locating the founding, and it's founding an image, and that's why I personally think that it's about painting, and not about, I don't know, cutting up or something like that. We had a discussion in one of the tutorials whether or not the work that Alberto is doing is actually painting or something else. And
I hope it wasn't really a discussion. I hope it was just to tease me, because to me, just to say that it's not painting is kind of offending. Like I'm so
yes,
much.
I know you were wounded a little bit.
Like I'm so much into it that it just seems impossible to me. No, you're not a believer then.
Yeah.
That's my religion.
Yeah, no, it was a bit like that, wasn't it? No, I don't actually think it was being sent up. I think that the person who was suggesting that wasn't painting was actually saying it wasn't painting. And so, but you are then required to understand what you mean by painting, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's positive.
And one of the things that one can mean by painting, which I gave you that wonderful book on assassination of experience by painting, you hated it, and you hated it again when you decided to give it another go, you still hated it, is that painting, from this argument, is actually the suspension of experience. That's what makes it work as painting. And that's exactly what Leotard's saying. That's why painting assassinates experience. Although I think he went too far. I think it only suspends it. It doesn't kill it.
Yeah.
But anyway, so what Foucault is doing, so the Foucauldian move is to suspend. This Foucauldian move is to explore how this distance and proximity operates in order to create a materiality which creates, if it's political power, if it's aesthetic tone, timbre, something like that. Yes.
About proximity and distance, and
Yeah.
about the thing that before you were talking about ISIS and rhizomatic.
Yeah.
This is just an idea that I have now, so I don't think it's going to be probably very clear, but you said ISIS as an example of something that is rhizomatic. Like, seen from your point of view, if you cut the head, still it's not a big deal because it grows again. But then I was thinking, maybe rhizomatic in the sense of sort of cancer thing.
Like a virus, like a viral.
Yeah, but I was thinking about a cancer rather than a
Yeah,
virus.
yeah, cancer's rhizomatic.
Yeah. It probably
spores.
has to do with the perspective that is external. Like, I think maybe it's not that they are rhizomatic and other things are not. It's just that if you are too far away from the core of its DNA, you see it as rhizomatic. Whereas if you are close to to its structure and its form, then you don't feel it as rhizomatic. You feel it as something that has its own fragility, because you know the order and you know that there's an order anyway. And if you cut the head too much, it's gonna turn into a different animal.
Mm-hmm.
So probably from their point of view, maybe even I don't know, the US as a place is rhizomatic in the sense that you might kill all the foreign people, but then the culture of being American is a rhizomatic thing, and like German people during the Cold War, they were like split in two, but they were German in two different ways, even though they were separating on a political level. So maybe.
So how do you understand rhizome? Because one thing we have to make sure is not the case. It's not about point of view. So.
I have the impression that rhizomatic has to do
I know.
with not understanding really, which is the very particularity
Yeah,
of that form, because
the-
there's always a form. So if you think that it's too much of a matter, it's just because you have your personal point of view is too ignorant of its structure of that thing, that line, that when you cross it, it stops to be that thing and
Yeah.
becomes something else.
No. Okay, and the reason no is because a rhizome, what is meant by rhizome is that it doesn't have a root. That's what a rhizome is. I mean, whatever else it is. And the argument is that in order to understand something, there's only a select number of ways to do this. One is to have an outside entity give meaning to the thing. That's like usually God gives meaning to, so if something happens, it's God's will. So there's an outside force that makes something happen. That's one very typical old-fashioned way, but still exists today. Another one, this with Hegel onward, was to understand logic as happening within the system. So there was no outside anything. Whatever happened had to be within the argument, as it were. So it didn't matter where you stood, it was true, no matter if you stood on your head or South Pole or wherever, it was true. That was the notion of the universal. Now, what's happening here, and this is where, that's why I'm saying the example with ISIS, etc., might be too flimsy at this point, because it's not properly analyzed. But the point is, and this is where Foucault's lecture 6 is more important than going to the ISIS thing, but is to try and focus your mind on this, is that he's making an argument that there is a different kind of relationship of how meaning gets established that no longer deals with the dialectical move, basically. So he's taking a Heideggerian move, which is the dwelling, the relation between being and Dasein, this kind of thing that creates the belonging and the separation at the same time. He takes this and he says, I want to radicalize this. I want to show how the political is shot through on all of this, even if it seems completely not political. And we'll get back to that in a second. So he uses this notion of flow and deterritorialization, which has been translated as rhizome. Now, he never uses the word rhizome, but it's translated as rhizome, which is to say that is there a way of understanding how something can establish meaning without literally having a ground? That's the quest. Without really having an ontological first. That's what he's doing. Now, whether or not he does it correctly or whether or not it's right, another whole question, or whether or not ISIS is really ontologically grounded or not grounded and so on and so forth, that's a different issue. And so that was probably slightly mistaken for me to put it in on the table and not use what we were looking at, chapter 6. But I guess a different way of putting the same thing back to you is there a way to understand how something can create a start, like something can be founded, or something can create this start, without resorting to either God or a dialectical formation where they get sublated, so that the game is to say from wherever you are, doesn't matter what your opinion is, or from wherever you're standing, this is what it is, this is the is.
But wouldn't that be maybe phenomenology, something like?
Yeah, well, he is phenomenology.
Yeah, so like
what?
Like the rhizomatic would be like something that goes together to a phenomenological move, like you.
Well, but the question is, 1 + 1 is 2 in everywhere, right? It doesn't matter if it's phenomenology, it doesn't matter if it's, and the question is, can that argument, the same kind of argument, like 1 + 1 is 2, can that be true in understanding aesthetics or epistemology? And Foucault is saying, yes, it can be true. Here's how it's done. It's the same kind of argument that Adorno was giving in negative dialectics. It's not my view, it's it is what happens. This is what happens. Now what's interesting about this particular is that it's a different way of constructing the ground than before the Industrial Revolution or before the Information Age. Because for me, one of the arguments that Foucault is leading to, and certainly a lot of the work that's being done here is leading to, is that in the Information Age, you have yet another milestone that happens. Oh. You have another milestone that is creating a very different way of making this ground situated as ground. And I would be willing to argue, actually, I mean, I certainly think with the Al-Qaeda thing, when the US went after Osama bin Laden, for example, as the leader, that was just an afterthought. I mean, it wasn't really an afterthought, but it had to be done from the perspective of the Americans because, or the West, because they had made him into this evil head, but to be honest, it didn't do anything. It didn't change.
Because we create enemies in our own image.
Well, perhaps, but I mean, yes, that's possible, but also because in killing Osama bin Laden, it didn't take out the problem.
But you need
Because it's not a
you need
problem.
a face to punish.
Well,
something.
yes, I mean, that's
Otherwise-
why it happened, but I'm just saying that analytically, it's just off. It's because there's a totally different board game going on, yeah.
Is this why? Sorry,
Does that
to
make sense? Yeah,
to
go
read
on.
this another Foucauldian term of archaeology.
Yeah,
Is this why it's not necessarily just that there's a norm and then there's removing the norm and there's a social and there's a weaving of the social, and from that arises this new idea of a norm, of a head without, or you create the body without necessarily needing a real head as the ground is ground. Is that it's not that necessarily the temporality is simply just following those courses, but actually they're all existing at the same time.
yes, exactly.
So the archaeologist, in a sense, is a dipping back through that cycle and finding, dragging it back up
Yeah.
from, well, not necessarily from the subconscious back to the conscious, but yeah, there's those kinds of.
Yeah, and so, I mean, I think that Foucault may have regretted the term archaeology because it was like digging. And there is no underground, there's just the ground.
Yeah.
It's just the question becomes how thick is the ground, how thick is the surface? And then it gets another crazy, it goes into another, Yeah.
I think there's a comment, and I don't know whether it's in Deleuze that says it, but he says it's an archaeology of the present.
it's an
which I think
archaeology of
is
the
trying to
present,
get
yeah.
over that problem, isn't
Yeah.
it?
There's no digging down.
Yeah.
And so the question is how that present presents itself, presence makes
Yeah.
itself present,
Yeah.
Oh,
All right.
I was just wondering whether I could read these from this
Mhm.
section.
I don't know,
I just
go
think
ahead.
it relates to.
Where,
Well,
what
it's
is
the bit
it?
where I'm discussing Jacques Monnery,
So it's from Leotard.
Yeah.
Okay, what page?
On page 229.
In the Leotard book.
Yeah, it's not like from the book, this is what I put it in.
Oh, I see, oh.
Sorry.
No.
So in the second extract, we find Leotard discussing the work of the artist Jacques Monnery. That is, one might say, with a nod to the decisiveness mentioned above, decisively painting. Sorry, it gets into what I want to do. So, decisively painting in quotes, and that is like a testimony to that witness of experience where there is yet the unverifiable, rather than just the reality of fact, and testimony too to the witness that yet is of the unverifiable. So one might say to the testimony and witness that only endures via perishing elsewise, and by what Leotard as only the infinity of established impossible interactions contained in the very principle of technical science and capital. So the key aspect I think is how we get this aspect of testimony and witness that only endures via perishing elsewise, which actually I would say is like, in relation to this Foucault, it's like there's a sort of problem with the speaking, like the instrument that's being the new instrument is a new form of history, which is, in the way it's being used, is sort of well, it's like this. It's still like this sort of reclaiming this, sticking back together the subjects of representation. It's that kind of history as a sort of a weapon being used, I think. Although he's not arguing for that, but he's setting that out.
So why is
as
it?
opposed to getting this bit where, if we're relating it to this sort of, because you said suspension with Leotard, and I'm not sure suspension is quite the word I would use, because I think it's this more this testimony and witness that only endures by perishing elsewise. So suspension too much suggests a holding, something held.
Exactly.
There's still a bit of a holding of something, whereas it's actually, to me, it's like to really to be something that. Can I read this next bit? This bit? So here the key distinctions we find Leotard making are between one, the artist's rejection of a presentation of negative infinity with regard to the sublime of transcendence. Or maybe that's not too good to read. Well, I have to read this bit to get to the next. Perhaps that's here, the key distinctions we find Leotard making are between one, the artist's rejection of a presentation of a negative infinity with regard to the sublime of transcendence. That is to say, rejection of just reinstalling the mathematical sublime of Kantian beauty, where the infinite, immeasurable, merely exceeds representation by imagination, and say when we find beautiful depiction of this as the abyss of the void, rather than the Kantian dynamical sublime, where the shock is of immanence, as the disruption is of another order, the subject to that of being dislodged. So this is to do with this dislodged or dispossession. So, and two, the artist's presentation of a disruption of the positive infinity of the reality of the world of neo-technological rationality, and critically in order to bear witness to the sublime of immanence. So it's this book. Leotard is arguing that what is resisted by this artist's work is the assassination of experience by the only experience of reality permitted by that of the world of neo-technological rationality, that of verifiable experience, the think of measuring metrics, of the real that satisfies the requirements of infinite rational verification. Monnery's work, it is claimed, pertains to a witnessing where the there is not reducible to the fact which is that produced on the basis of axiomatics and of the infinitudes of knowledges. This fact is described as mere artifact of such, as it is disencumbered by the witness that endures by perishing elsewise.
So is it is what you're saying, and linking it back to what we're doing here, that this thing called experience, that Foucault is both putting forward as let's say the ground on some level, and at the same time not the ground as we would actually understand it, is what you're calling techno-capitalist ground of some kind, and that ground has manufactured a reality that is mainly rooted in axiomatic notions of verification, and that the artist suspends or is able to found, as it were, a different kind of experience, the kind of experience that cannot be subsumed in the technocratic or the notion of the artifact as such. Is that what you're basically saying?
Well, I would say the artist is
Yes or
able
no?
to, well, just that bit where you said the artist is able to found, I don't know if you said a different kind of experience, but I wouldn't call it experience, because experience puts it back into
Yeah, I
the
agree with that.
subject.
Yeah.
So
what does the artist found?
I would say, like, it could, difference.
The artist found
That's
difference.
the difference,
Yes.
is that perishing, elsewise,
Wait, before you do that, Dane.
I'm just looking at my notes on Leotard's assassination experience, and Leotard picks up on Monet's paintings as taking on a sort of life of their own, and they're also, on page 9 he talks about the revolt of represented things. What is represented in Monet's hyperrealism, it starts to revolt against any form of representation that's tried to be put on it, and it has a force of its own. And he says that representation's ruin is that of the subject and of power. The subject and power have or can bring about the ruin of any sort of representation
Right.
that's sort of given to them, or that's
And why is
assumed.
that? Why is it that representation appears to be such a good thing for, let's say, art on one level and notions of power or politics on the other? Why is it the ruination?
Well, representation gives the arts a sort of ground in order. If art is representing something, then it has a meaning behind
The
what
meaning.
it's doing. But if the art then turns that around and it starts to revolt against what it's given, then it finds a way to what's the word?
Express?
It turns the tables in a way that it brings in the subjects and the power in a different way. That there's, even though Todd said that there's always these forces that are behind the representation, but are always sort of repressed by despots or an emperor. And so, if say the artist can in fact bring out these forces out of repression by leading this revolt of represented things, then make them, you sort of start to get art that really does revolt against.
Well, really does invent, really does create. And so, if we can link that now to this notion of the materiality, as it were, that Foucault is addressing in this sort of diagram that Mark has offered up, which is very useful, I think. Can you take it the one step further and link it with what we've done so far with this founding? Because at the moment, I mean, otherwise we are stuck with what Alberto's saying is, point of view. And the artist as the individual sort of genius who looks at the canvas or whatever they do is doing something, but Foucault is bringing in something of a plurality.
Rather than just point of view, I was trying to say it as a matter of proximity and distance. Like,
Okay.
it's not just that.
Yeah.
So if you get into the field of force, you get close enough, then you see the event or the thing emerging. Otherwise, if you're too far away, if your perspective, it just.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. But what I think, challenging you on was not so much that, was my worry was that you were not grasping the actuality of a rhizome, that it has no root.
No, I think it's not that I don't grasp that. I was just saying that anything can have no root or have root. Depends if you are in proximity of that, or if you're too far away from that. I just think that
Yes, and I'm challenging you on that. I'm saying that it's not dependent on proximity and distance, whether or not it has a root. You're right, that is what the issue is.
Is that because otherwise you have to find a subject?
Yes.
Because you've already, by that gesture of claiming a perspective is the same gesture of creating a root.
Yeah, exactly right.
yeah. But otherwise, how can you tell?
That this is the question. This is exactly the question. But your work, for example, doesn't require, well, it requires proximity and distance, but it doesn't require the subject to read it.
Yeah, but it requires.
So intuitively,
But-
you know what to do.
Yeah, but it requires the subject to behave in a certain way, or at least not to behave in other ways. Because if the subject that gets into the space and see the thing starts doing the wrong things, it will never deal with the artwork in a way that the artwork will be enabled to express its being. It will be analyzed and it will be killed by an analysis.
Yes.
So in that way, I think that I can't say that I can do or anybody can do anything that is really rhizomatic, no matter, because
No, I think that there's a fundamental misunderstanding of rhizome here. That's what I think the problem is, because you do actually expect the work to be received rhizomatically. It's just that because what you're hearing in that is that reception could be wrong, in which case they'll kill the painting. But there is no, but to have it, the painting itself makes that happen.
yeah.
Okay, because the painting makes that happen, it doesn't really matter the point of view. I mean, people get it wrong. That's their issue. It's not the painting that's doing. That's not the fact of the way in which the entity that's being founded is operating. It doesn't require a subject. It actually doesn't require an audience. It doesn't require. This is what Foucault is saying. It is something else is going on here. Now you were going to say something, right, Ed?
I was just curious. This tie in. Thinking about. Yeah, he starts chapter 6 by talking about stories of origin.
Yeah.
And we've talked about this as you establish a norm as a way of founding a beginning. Levi Strauss is famous for, amongst other things, looking at it in a structuralist way,
Yeah.
Comparative mythology, looking at a number of different ways of the different cultures have told themselves stories about their origins. You could look at the Bible, the number of different creation stories that exist within the Bible, for example. I don't know enough of that, so I'm feeling my way here.
Yeah, yeah.
But it's one way of seeing this Foucauldian move is taking that away from there being some kind of substantive thing that can be found in these by comparing these myths together. There is some kind of generic story,
Mm-hmm.
and putting time into all of that. So it's not so much that this is something that's made; it's a making, or it becomes a founding rather than a ground, or a grounding rather than a ground.
Yeah, the gerund.
Yeah, and since that's a
But the time that you're putting in there is durational. It's
Yes,
not. It's
yeah.
not chronological. Let's put it
Yes,
that.
yeah.
Yeah, I think that's about right.
okay.
Yeah.
When Lyotard in Peregrinations, he's talking about Cézanne that deals with the mountains,
Mhm.
Saint Michel. Like in that case, that works rhizomatically. Like the phenomenon or the something what
Yeah.
happens in front of Cézanne. It's actually a massive piece of stone.
Right. Yeah.
So in that case, I think it has to do with the viewer. It has to do with Cézanne. It's not the mountain that works that way for everybody in every moment.
No, that's true. No, in that example is correct.
But also, like you can when Zen Buddhists put anything into a tokonoma, which is a sacred space. You can put a branch, you can put a stone, you can put whatever into that. then while you're having your tea ceremony and in this moment of calm and thing, then that sacred space makes anything that is into that space sacred. So it's not because of that stone is particularly beautiful, but it's because you create the space for that stone to become a phenomenon, even though it's just.
Okay, but the difference then, okay, we're looking at it slightly differently. What do you think is the difference between that example and what Foucault is talking about there?
I think.
Because that doesn't require a reviewer.
I think probably getting back to something I read recently from Blanchot, the difference is that one thing brings the space by itself, and one thing requires a release space. So in the case of my painting, I don't want to be too much auto-referential. I hope my work brings its own space.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas in the case of the stone in the tokonoma, then it's the tokonoma, the space, and so the difference is that.
Yeah,
it's
and
it's
so
not
the
relational.
aesthetic that you're doing is based on this kind of move. It's not about the point of view.
Yeah.
Right, okay, so it's good. You do realize what you just agreed to.
Yeah,
Okay.
I realize that, but at the same time, I can't forget about the stone. I can't forget
And you're
that
not
if
being-
I would put my stuff in the wrong place, it wouldn't work anyway, because I can't claim that it's so appealing that would attract people attention if it's in the wrong place where there's too much noise. You
But
know?
of course,
Still you need the.
but that's not about point of view, that's about power.
Yeah, it's about a structure.
It's about structure, yeah. Now, is that going to lead into what you were going to mention?
It was just now. I'm not so sure now. Yeah.
It was just now, but not.
Yeah.
Can we read this paragraph on assassination, or is that not?
Yeah, no, go on. Don't ask the question, just go for it.
So, in what ways the notion of assassination too can be grasped here is important, though the nuances of its deployment remain rather slippery to pin down. So, there are many ways to literally die, and yet we can perhaps now see that even when we don't die literally, we do die literally and more readily than we think. We can say that there are many ways to die by so-called experience without the end recognised as mortal death. But the emphasis with the act of assassination is that there is no one to see the killing, perhaps not even the victim sees it. And importantly, also being raised is the case in which the victim has already been assassinated, this prior eradication possibly making any such further assassination superfluous. Therefore, we can say that the questions being raised are in what ways there is witnessing or no witnessing, and hence can be testimony or none. In what ways regimes of reality, including regimes of the construct of experience, can actually eradicate witnessing and testimony, even to the extent of there then being no possibility, even if there is need for the assassination of experience by painting. Again, the distinctions being made are between that which claims the experience of its dying, that of the transcendence of the subject which has the experience, is in possession of its experience, and as such also forms an assassination of experience as its subjectivity, and that for which dying entails something more violent, witnessing as dispossession, and where the tables of regimes might yet be turned by the decisiveness of the critical function of the artwork. So the critical function of the artwork is in quotes indeed.
So how does that link? You're right. I mean, this is, we've had a long tutorial on this today, so I know where you're coming from, but everybody else does not.
Well,
So you need to.
So to here he's introducing sort of
Hear who?
Oh, Foucault is sort of where he says that instrument. Here we are.
What page?
Page 135. Where he says how a certain instrument of struggle was actually forged in the struggles that took place around the workings of power, struggles within power and against power. That instrument is a knowledge, a new, or at least partly new knowledge, the new form of history, the recall of history in this form. So this kind of particular sort of handling of knowledge or kind of deploying of knowledge as a weapon sort of seems to be more like the sort of Socratic kind of.
Well, yes, I mean, he is explaining how the technocratic capitalist moment starts to emerge, and not as this homogeneous position, but as this heterogeneic position.
So they're kind of like propaganda sort of machines of the kind of way he's sort of saying that the monarch then creates the ministries of administration and finance and stuff, to sort of gain back some power. So there's these power games going on with how they create these recollections, these histories, historical knowledges, discursivity. Whereas like I think like what he's going to sort of go on to is more make a sort of case for what would you think like really it's a sort of non-discursive power in the arts. But we're not here. He's sort of.
Well, here we're just going to get down what discursive is. You're right. He does go on to talk about the non-discursive.
So I mean they believe sort of like liberational sort of powers in knowledges.
It
So
has
when
to
he's
do with
talking
how.
about society or the speaking, but it depends what you do with it. So.
But who's the you that does?
Well, he's where he says about sort of where he says nation here isn't what it's sort of like you know it hasn't become later. He says it's race and class, but then he says sort of he says the nation, or rather nations, or in other words, the collections, societies, groupings of individuals who share status, mores, customs, and a certain particular law, in the sense of regulatory statutes rather than status laws. So there's sort of but regulatory statutes. It's almost like the games you play. So these are sort of the conventions or the like. Not necessarily. I mean, we could have like status laws. Maybe that's the sort of. I guess that's the sort of judicial kind of. There's sort of laws and things on that level. Or there's just sort of the game playing of conventions and what the regimes of truth, the sort of that these groups that we speak. And it's those elements that will begin to speak. It is the nation that begins to speak. But I mean. But it sort of becomes corrupted when it there's a sort of power of operation that can be deployed. Well, that's what you could relate it to the decisiveness of what you do. You like speak the historical subject of racism or class. Kind of make these histories stick them together in representation, or do you work with it? Work with like.
But who's the you?
Oh.
Be very careful, because you could slip in a point of view and then just reinitiate the entire edifice of subject, object, universality, so on and so forth. He's trying to show how new subjectivities emerge. And they emerge through this micro dance that happens. Now, there's more to it, obviously, than just this little bit. I mean, so the very first thing you present, Barbara, in your discussion is the relationship between founding and founded. Founded and found, rather. And why I keep pointing to Alberto, because his work directly founds. And it doesn't require, despite what you're saying, it doesn't require the point of view. You're thinking it requires a point of view because there's different shadings and different ways in which, no. Why are you thinking it requires a point of view?
It rather than a point of view requires the possibility to enter into a perceptive modality.
Perceptive modality,
That
yeah,
is
that's
not,
different.
That is not necessarily the perceptive modality that you have all the time. So in that case,
that makes sense.
Yeah.
But you see, what I guess I'm worried about in the class right now, my new worry, is I want to make sure that we understand what it means to form a ground without having a root. That's the key here. That you've got to get this. It's critical. And why this root is a problem. You know, because otherwise you will keep rehearsing very old forms of metaphysics, and it'll interrupt. I mean, it's not necessarily a tragedy. It just means that your work will not provide the kind of vitality that you're trying to get for it. Like, because you're trying to emphasize, for example, atmosphere, or the way in which these different energies come together to create this thing called paint, or painting even. So that's what I want to make sure you get. What is this rhizome? What is the root? Why do we call it ontology? What does it mean to found something as opposed to find something? What is this invention? And who's the you that does the inventing? What does it mean to have a collective singularity? That's what we're getting at here. These are very tough terms. That something has a surface and no other side, and the surface that has no other side is a singularity, but itself is plural, means that there's always a pattern. And if there's a pattern, it's got to be plural. The pattern doesn't have to be exact. It's not an exact pattern, like, you know, a square, this exact square being repeated. A pattern can be a rough pattern. And he's showing how these rough patterns get established.
It looks like a magnetic field.
It could be like a magnetic field.
That things can point in different directions, but there is something which may not be apparently there. It could be like, I don't know my cosmology well enough, but it could be a black hole.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, in a sense, you can surmise that it's there because of the way in which things are structured around it.
Yes, and you can and you can also see literally how it's structured. Like your talk that you gave the other day. Can you remember part of it on the magnetic singular, the plurality of the singular?
Yeah, I mean, in the tape, in a way, it's works in that sense that